All right. It's 11:30, so I'm going to get started. And as you're coming in, if you want to get closer, I'll be showing some code, so you might want to come in a little bit closer, but you do not have to. Hey, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Dalia, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the lessons I learned building AI-powered features. Before I get started, I'd love to know a little bit more about the audience. So show of hands, how many people have tried to build some kind of prototype with AI? Great, lots of hands. Now, how many people have actually shipped any features or or applications to production that uses AI? Okay, less hands. Awesome, that's why I'm here, because I discovered on my journey of shipping AI-powered features that it's a lot different than traditional software. And I wanted to share with you some of the lessons I learned throughout this journey. A little bit about me. My name is Dalia. I am a product manager at Microsoft. I work on a product called Visual Studio. How many people are familiar? Awesome. For those of you that haven't raised their hand, it's basically Microsoft Word, but for developers. And I more specifically work on integrated GitHub Copilot into Visual Studio. Before that, I used to work as an engineering lead on modernization tooling. I did backend development, and I've been a developer advocate. So I've had many roles throughout tech. But if you ask me, Dalia, like, what exactly are you? I'll tell you I'm a software engineer. I love building software. I love seeing the computer do something that it couldn't do before. That's my happy place. So when all this AI stuff happened and the boom happened about a year and a half ago, I played around with ChatGPT, and I thought it was pretty cool. But I was like, this is not my problem. This is the data scientists and data analysts and all those folks that know AI really well. I'm not doing any of this because I'm a software engineer. And for me, all of that changed on May 23rd, 2023. I was attending a talk, just like this one, and one of the presenters, Kevin Scott, came on, and he described what a copilot is. And the way he described it was a copilot is an application using modern AI to assist you in complex cognitive tasks. So at its core, it's an application. And it's also used to make complex cognitive tasks less complex and help users with those. So at the core of complex cognitive tasks is coding or programming. So I had an aha moment thinking, okay, like Visual Studio, it's supposed to help you code better, review better, debug better, all these things. It's pretty cognitively taxing task. But what really resonated with me was when one of the OpenAI folks came on stage and said, you know, we're doing all these great things in OpenAI with the models and all these innovations, but the thing that we cannot do at scale is go into every domain and figure out how to make this technology work in that domain. So maybe I'm not specifically an expert in training models or AI or whatever it is, but I am an expert in my users, in my developers. What are they trying to do every day? What are the things that are getting in their way? So I decided, okay, I'm going to go off and I'm going to figure out how can we make AI work for our developers, our users, and that's what I would like to leave with you. It's that you're an expert in your domain. You're an expert in your users. It's up to you to figure out how do you make AI work for your users and make them more productive and help them with their tasks. Now, my problem was that I didn't really know a lot about like these models or anything like that, but I had all the passion in the world to learn. So I went off and did that. And 6 months later, I was in that exact same building announcing my team's first feature, AI feature, to the public. And since then, it's been used over 40,000 times in Visual Studio. And this is the feature I'm going to be talking about throughout the talk as a case study. I've built other features since then, but this is I think this is a good example of what you can do from scratch. Lessons learned. So we learned a lot. We made a lot of mistakes, and we learned a lot. And I'm a big fan of learning in public, so I want to share with you the 10 lessons that I learned throughout this journey. Lesson number 1. I'm a big fan of fundamentals. So lesson number 1 is to learn how AI works. It's okay to think it's magic if you're just using it as a consumer, you're using ChatGPT or writing an email, whatever it is. But if you're building with it, it's really important to understand how it works, its strengths and weaknesses, so that you can exploit it to its potential. So let's get specific. And we're going to start from basics and work our way up. So let's imagine there's a model, and it's been trained on lots and lots and lots of data, and it sees this sentence: I'm a bit jet lagged. It was an 8-hour blank. How would it complete this sentence? Any guesses? Trip, flight? Any other guesses? Delay? Plane ride? Ordeal. Love that. All of those answers are right. It'll tell me I can complete it with flight, trip, ride, journey, mission. None of these answers are incorrect, but the top answer is the most probable answer because it's looking at the probability that this is the next token or the next word. So whenever developers come to me and tell me, oh, I'm trying different things, and sometimes it gives me this answer, and sometimes it gives me that answer, I'm like, this is what you should be expecting. This is the nature of this technology. You should not try to write a deterministic application like you used to before. You should think about how do you get it more likely to print out what you should expect. Or how do you design a system that keeps it in mind that it's a non-deterministic technology? So in order to build good applications and figure out how to solve problems well, you need to understand the strength of these AI technologies. And I'm going to be really focused on generative AI because that's a lot of the work that we did. So let's talk about strength. First strength is that these models are really good at generating code or generating content in general. So in this example, which is not super visible, but I'm going to tell you what's on there. In this example, in Visual Studio, for example, you notice that when you type in the first 2 lines of code, like I'm writing a rock, paper, scissors game, and I say game, it auto-completes the rest of that code like fully. And the reason it does that is because it's seen rock, paper, scissors lots of times in data. And that's why it does really well with boilerplate code, and maybe not so well if it's a language that is super obscure and no one has heard about it. So the example that I use here is you want to generate, if you want to generate content somewhere in your application, and it's something that you know there's a lot of data out there that can help you out, generating content is a great strength to use in your application. The other thing it's really good at is having conversations. That's why we saw a boom in the chatbot. So if your application can use a chatbot, this is a great strength to take advantage of. But by the way, like not every application needs a chatbot. So like let's just cool it on the chatbots. So in this case, in Visual Studio, we use the chatbot a lot for developers to ask questions, learn more about how to build this code, or maybe explain a piece of code. So the chatbot is another entry point for developers to learn more as they're writing code. One of my favorite strengths of generative AI is summarizing content. And this is one of my favorite features in Visual Studio. So if you have GitHub Copilot and you go to commit your code, you'll see this button that says generate commit message. and it'll generate a commit message based on the changes you made in your code. What's really great for this is that it's taken advantage of that strength of summarizing content. This is something models are really good at. They take a lot of content and summarize it. And in this case, it's taking a lot of the diff of your changes, a lot of the diff in your code, and summarizing it into a commit message. So this is a really great strength to take advantage of for your application. And there's a lot of other strengths. You know, you can generate images, language translations, personalization, and so on and so forth. But there are also weaknesses. It's important to understand the weakness so you can build around the weaknesses that it has. There are three that I want to highlight here, which is, first, context. These models do not have context. They don't know who you are. They don't know what role you're trying to do, like what job you're trying to do. So adding that context is important. And if you give it too much context, it'll be very confused. So you need to work with the model to figure out, hey, how much context do you need to give me the answer that I need you to give me? The other one is accuracy. We've heard a lot about hallucination, fabrications, whatever you want to call it. Accuracy is something, again, like it's built into the technology, but we do want to work around the technology to figure out how can we get it to give us more accurate results more often. And the last one is bias. These models are trained on data that is out there, and sometimes that data is biased. So we want to make sure that we're protecting our users and we're building in some safeguards against those biases. Lesson number 2, identify an unmet user need. How many times have you seen something built and you're wondering, like, why did they build that? Right? Like, a lot of applications out there or a lot of features should not be built. And this happens if you do not start with a problem and you only start with a solution. So I hear a lot of engineers that are like, Dalia, we're like sprinkling AI everywhere. Well, if you feel that way, that's a problem. We need to be starting with the problem and working backwards. If you attended the Community Leadership Summit, we talked about finding problems and starting with the problem. And I want to show you an example of how we did that. So at the core, you need to figure out in your application or your use case, what problem are you trying to solve? What's your mission? So for us, our mission is we need to empower every developer to do more. Okay, so what is stopping developers from doing more today? And I wish I could get a bunch of users in one room and ask them, hey, like, what's stopping you from doing all these things? Well, it turns out I have access to those same specific users because Visual Studio engineers use Visual Studio to build Visual Studio. So I got them all in a room and I asked them, hey, what's your least favorite part of your job? And they looked at me and they're like, what do you mean? Like, I hate a lot of things about my job. I'm like, everything, just let's have it. I'd love to have a venting session. And everything flowed. So things like, hey, I am so scared of making any changes in any code that doesn't have tests, so I don't touch it. Or I hate reading someone else's code. Or I made changes and my tests started failing. These are not new problems. These are fundamental problems that we have as developers. So the question is, how do you take a problem that users have had for many, many years, and maybe you can finally make a dent in it. Maybe you can finally resolve that problem more effectively. So my advice to anyone that's looking into this space, I always tell them, hey, you want to look at your user need, what people are trying to do in your field, and you want to combine it with some of the strengths of generative AI, and the sweet spot is right in the middle. But I do want to caution here, this is something I learned as we were doing this, be careful with analysis paralysis. I've worked with so many teams where they're sitting there for months trying to decide which feature is the best one to build, and if they had just built a feature, they would have learned from it and shipped it and moved on by the time they made that decision. So that's where lesson number 3 comes in. Build something, like anything, just build something. Luckily, after that conference, 2 weeks later, there was a hackathon. So I got all my team together, and I was like, hey, do y'all want to participate in the hackathon? And they said, sure, let's do it. And we built this feature called CodeShine. I thought I was clever coming up with that name, but we didn't end up shipping it, so we're good. So in this feature, here's what it does. There's a light bulb in Visual Studio. It says CodeShine with Copilot, and on the left side, you see, like, maybe you finished writing some method really quickly. You're like not really worried about making it super clean. You write it up, and this button lets you take your method and make it more concise, make it more readable, generate some docs for you, and improve your parameters and method names. And then on the side here, you get a summary. At the top of the summary, you get all the changes that change to your logic, so you can pay closer attention to that. And at the bottom is all the other changes we made for you. And off we went. This was a great learning opportunity. I always tell people, if you get a chance, please build with this technology. Don't just learn about it, but also build with it. The reason why it was a great learning experience is because, first off, it forced me to download some things that I've always wanted to download, never got a chance to. How many times do you say, oh, I'm going to try this app or this tool or whatever, and you never get around to it, you know? For me, that was GitHub Copilot. I just was like, someday I'll install it. Finally, I installed it for this hackathon. And the other thing that was really important is prompt engineering. A lot of people talk about prompt engineering. I felt like this was one of the biggest lessons I learned as I was building these features, is how to prompt better, how do you get the model to do things better, and I'll talk a lot about that as we move on. APIs and libraries, what kind of libraries are available out there, with what languages, and so on and so forth, and the strengths and weaknesses. It's one thing to know that something is like a strong suit of AI, but it's another when you see it working or see it not working. And definitely limitations. So you can hear about token limits all you want, but when you're sending a request and you're like waiting for that response, and it tells you, oh, you've reached the token limit, that hits you a lot harder. That's why I say, please build something. And of course, tons of troubleshooting, which every developer is very familiar with. But the best reason to prototype is to have something to show to a user or some of your users and validate that they actually want it, like they actually, you're building the right things. So that's when lesson number 4 comes in. Be ready to pivot and iterate. So we ended up taking CodeShine and showing it to some of our users. We have these quick pulses that we run with users where we show them some of our features that we're thinking about, and we get some input. And there were lots of red flags. So I'll share with you some of the red flags that we learned. First off, one of the users looked at the red on the left and the green on the right, and he was like, ooh, that looks really good. I'm just going to accept that. And I kind of panicked for a minute because like they assumed that this is just fine. They didn't even review it. They just were wanting to accept it. I think they saw the green and they were like, green is good, let's accept. I was like, okay, that's not gonna work. And the other problem I realized was that I put it in light bulb. And if you think about light bulb, a lot of times the change that it's suggesting is coming from a compiler. So you know it's right. Or it's based on specific static rules that you know are gonna be correct. So that's the moment I discovered, okay, we're not putting it in the right place. One of my other favorite red flags is someone looked at that summary on the right and was like, I'm not reading that. I was like, oh, that's fair. I wouldn't read it either. But there were also green flags. One of the users looked at CodeShine, and he saw that we changed the names of the method and the variable, and he was like, it looks like it inferred the variable name, and I'm not really sure how. So that was when we took that green flag and turned it into a feature. So I'm going to switch to a demo here. Oh, let's see if I can do it with one hand. All right, so switch to Visual Studio and hope that this part goes well. All right, so this is Visual Studio, maybe. Do I need to do anything to switch it? All right, let's try this. We're gonna change to duplicate and see if it registers. You know, I didn't think there was enough risk with all the PowerPoint slides, so I figured let's introduce some risk here. Okay. All right, folks can see it? Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit just so that y'all can see it. All right, so here I have a rock, paper, scissors game. And let's say you're reading someone's code and you're like, ugh, these names are awful. Like, what does choice 1 do? Or maybe you wrote something really quickly and you just didn't take the time to name it correctly. You did like X and Y or whatever. You right-click on one of the variables, you want to change it, and you say, hey, I want to rename. And now with this feature, what's going to happen is we're going to give you 3 suggestions on the variable name. Now notice what the suggestions are. It's player choice, user choice, first choice. How did it figure out that it's a player or a game? Typically in software engineering, you'd have to kind of infer the type or infer the name based on the type. So you can, the best you can do is like choice 1 because it's a choice type. But in this case, it's looking at how this variable is used. It's summarizing what this variable does into a name, because that's basically what an identifier name is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a description of what this identifier does. And that's, I think this was a beautiful moment, because I couldn't have done this before. But because I have access to this model that's really good at taking a lot of info and summarizing it, I was able to actually suggest some good names instead of having the developer read through the code and remember what this variable name did. Same thing with like if I go to choice 2. Now if I do rename here, now it tells me it's computer choice. How did it know it was computer choice? It's looking at the logic and it's determining that it's the opponent's choice. So I can accept that and go on. One thing that we also notice with this feature is that if you try to rename methods, it does even better. The reason why is because it has the entire method right in front of it, so it can infer what the method is trying to do. But with a variable, sometimes it spans different classes. So in this case, like, oh, get result message, determine outcome message, generate result message. I like this one, so I'm going to take it. So that's rename suggestions. So let's dig in. How did we end up actually building this? So the first thing you want to do if you're building your own feature or application is figure out, okay, what am I trying to do here? In my case, I wanted to click on a button like rename, and I wanted the model to return to me 3 suggested names. I needed to figure out what do I need to send the model to get it to give me those 3 names. First, I need to send it a prompt. In this case, I have a prompt that says a software developer is using an AI rename feature in a code editor. Your task is to help a developer improve the symbol ... I'll talk to you a little bit more about the prompt later. But the idea is you need to tell the model what you're trying to do, and you need to give it that context. And then I want the model to return to me a JSON object that has the names so I can parse it and present it to the user. So you want to break down your problem into, okay, what do I need to do? And how do I need to do it? And this is where lesson number 5 comes in, which is a good prompt is key. This is so important. This turned out to be really important in this space. What's prompt engineering? Prompt engineering is the practice of designing inputs for generative AI tools that will produce optimal outputs. Optimal, not perfect, but optimal. So I want to show you the inner works. So when I first started working on this feature, what I did was I wrote this prompt. It said, your task is to help a developer improve the name of a variable. I figured I probably should tell it that it's a variable or a method because that matters, right? And I also told it, hey, indicate, the variable is indicated by something. And this is important when you're sending a prompt that has a lot of data. The model doesn't really know what part to pay attention to. So it's good to have that marker to say, hey, look here, this is what I want you to pay attention to. And then I sent it the code where the variable is. And I told it, return to me 3 variable names, describe how the variable is defined, follow the current document conventions, and follow the language best practices. So I thought, yeah, off we go, let's do this. This was the output. So notice, it did what I asked it to do. It returned to me 3 variable names, but this output does not work for me at all. First off, what is this format? Like, I can't parse that. It's like a C# block. It looks kind of like, yeah, I can't parse that. The other problem, that's even bigger problem, is that it changed the type for the variable, which had me panicking because I'm like, oh goodness, we're breaking everyone's code. So this is not going to work. But notice, the model did do what I asked it to do. 50 attempts later. So I tried a lot of prompts over and over and tried to figure out, okay, how do I get the model to actually return to me what I needed to return? And this was the prompt that we ended up shipping with. It says, a software developer is using an AI rename feature in a code editor. Your task is to help a developer improve their symbol. I noticed that you don't really need to tell it it's a variable, method, or class, because if it knows what the position is, it already knows whether it's a variable, or method, or class. So I removed that part. And then I sent it the code, and then I worked with my engineer to have him give me the ability to replace the exact variable with this name, this identifier marker, which was really good. The more specific you can get with your prompt to say, this is exactly what I want you to pay attention to, the better. And then I told it, given the provided information, give me a good 5 naming suggestions, and then so on and so forth. Now, another thing that I ran into was it was not returning JSON. I begged it to return JSON. I'm like, please return JSON. Please return JSON. It was not. And then someone was suggesting, hey, Dalia, if you send it an example, it'll be more likely to send you what you want. And that worked really well. So I sent it an example of the JSON object that I'd like, and there's a lot more sophisticated ways now that that I didn't have access to, but it's really important to know that the structured way that you can get the model to get you back data, that can run into a problem, but it finally did it when I gave it an example. And this was the outcome. It finally gave me the JSON object. I was able to parse it out and present it to the user. So one of the biggest lessons here, and the one I want to really share with you, is as you're writing your prompts, I highly recommend writing down your experimentation. You're kind of a scientist at this point. You're trying a prompt, seeing the result, trying a prompt, seeing the result, and so on and so forth. You want to document all those attempts and see what works and what doesn't until you're reliably getting the answer that you want. I wish I had this guide when I was writing my prompt, but I didn't. This is the OpenAI prompt engineering guide, and there's a lot of great guides out there. But it gives you tips on how to do some of this prompting. One of my favorite is like, tell the model to take a deep breath. And I'm like, I like that. So definitely recommend checking out some of these guides. This is one of my favorite. So lesson number 6 is start with a simple prompt technique. I talked to some of my friends, and they're like, Dalia, I want to build an AI feature. Let's go fine-tune a model. I'm like, why are you fine-tuning a model? I don't think that's what you need to do. So I always say start with the simplest techniques you can do in order to get a good answer. So let's talk about techniques. First technique is zero-shot prompting. Zero-shot prompting is where you tell the model to do something, and that's about it. So you go to the model and tell it, hey, tell me a joke. You send it to the LLM, and it's going to give you a joke. You don't give it anything else. If you can do this with your application and get the results you want, you should definitely do that, But a lot of times, that's not enough. That's where few-shot prompting comes in. Few-shot prompting is where you're sending a prompt, and you're also giving the model some examples. So in this case, I gave it 3 jokes that are food-related. So as a result, it will give me another joke that's food-related. I love few-shot prompting, and you saw some of those examples in rename suggestions, because a lot of these models are trained on enough data that if you prompt it correctly, you give it enough examples, it will give you what you need. There's also retrieval augmented generation. There was a really great session right before mine that talked about that. With retrieval augmented generation, you can actually query some data and feed it to the model when you're answering a prompt or returning a response. You'll notice that when you're doing things like with ChatGPT, that a lot of times it doesn't give you the most up-to-date answers, and it's because, at least for the free version, and it's because it's giving you answers based on the data that it was trained with. Now, what's nice about retrieval augmented generation is that you can augment the prompt and give it a little bit more up-to-date data so it can give you a better response. This is why when I'm doing research, I go to like Bing Copilot or some research engine, because they're also retrieving some search results and then feeding it to the model in order to get the answer. So in this case, maybe I tell it, hey, tell me a topical joke, something related to news nowadays. And it goes to query relevant data, it feeds it to the model, and then it gives me an AI joke, because that's a lot of the stuff we're talking about these days. And in this case, RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, is good if you really need to ground the model in some of the data for your users, or some of the newest data, or so on and so forth. Not every use case needs this. Like rename suggestions didn't need this. Like, it's seen a lot of code, it kind of knows what a good name is, but in other cases, you do need to do this. Finally is fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is when you actually train the model on some data. It's really good in like legal fields or medical fields and so on and so forth, but it is a more expensive and more complicated process. So here's an example. I discovered that when I came to the US, that jokes don't really translate well across cultures. So I could tell the model, tell me a joke in Arabic or for Egyptians to laugh at. And what it's going to do is going to go off and give me an English joke translated that won't be really funny. But what I can do is I can take a model and train it on thousands and thousands of Egyptian jokes. And if I feed it to the model, it finally will be able to give me a joke that Egyptians will find funny, but no one else will. But that's the idea. You'll see that in a lot of applications where it's very specific to a task. GitHub Copilot, for example, uses a fine-tuned model that's fine-tuned on code. That's why it does really well with coding questions, but if you ask it to create a recipe or do something like that, it won't do so well, because it's fine-tuned to actually answer coding questions. So which technique do you use for your case? I love this advice from Mark Rusinovich. He says, start with zero shot. That doesn't do the job. Go to few shot, and then try RAG, and finally do fine-tuning. In Visual Studio, we live in these two, second and third line, few shot and RAG. A lot of the application, a lot of the features we've built is really focused on these two methods in the middle. And that's where lesson number 7 comes in, which is when we started building a lot of these features, we got the advice very early on that we should really focus on more on the suggestion quality and less about the UI. The UI can look, you know, oh, this is a button, you should move it here, you should move it there. People really are nitpicky about the UI, but really the UI doesn't matter if your suggestions are awful. Users are not going to use your feature if you're giving them crap suggestions. And I see this mistake all the time. People don't spend enough time making sure that these suggestions you're making are actually helpful for the user. We actually recently also did a survey with our users, and we found that a suggestion accuracy and relevance has the highest correlation with user satisfaction, more than usability. Of course, you don't want your UI to be like, you can't use it well, but you want to be spending more of your time making sure that those suggestions are actually helpful for your users. So how do you do that? I love this quote. This is from one of the engineers on the VS Copilot team. He says, "Data is your superpower, even more so in an AI world." This is really important. Data is really important in this space because I showed you some of those suggestions that were made in Visual Studio, and you're probably sitting there thinking, oh, I would have chosen number 3, or I chose number 1. Like, what is a good suggestion? It's all subjective. So that's why it's really important to be measuring as much as you can and make sure that you're actually making a good impact on your user. So for our case, this is how we determined what a good feature is. What's a good feature? A good feature is one, like for rename suggestions, where the user saw 3 suggestions and accepted one of them. That means that those suggestions were good enough for them to accept it into their code and move on. So we're trying to figure out how do we improve those acceptance rates. The other one is request rate. If someone goes off and tries one of these features and it doesn't work for them, they're never going to try it again. So how much is the user using your feature? And the other one on the opposite end is error rate. So when I had that problem with the model not returning JSON, that error rate was really high because it kept coming back with not unparsable data, and the user would see an error, and that was a big problem. As soon as we fixed that and we fixed the prompt, that error rate went way down. So that's another data point. But it's not just quantitative data, it's also qualitative data. Because a lot of times you look at this data and you don't know quite why people aren't choosing these suggestions. So a lot of times we use surveys, we do interviews, and so on and so forth to get that feedback. Lesson number 8 is building responsibly. So responsible AI is really important when you're building features in this AI space. And I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what that means. So these are the principles for Microsoft for responsible AI: fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. When I saw all these principles, I was like, yes, I want to do all that. I just have no idea what that means. So I went off and learned, and I want to share with you what practically that might mean for an application. So for Visual Studio, for example, if you're trying to be transparent, it means that if a user uses any AI features, they need to know that they are interacting with AI. So you'll notice in a lot of the Copilot features or other AI features, you'll see disclaimers like AI suggestions might be inaccurate. It's really important that a user has trust in your tool and knows that they're interacting with AI. Not only because it's like the good thing to do, but it's also from a satisfaction perspective. If someone accepts something that you gave them based on AI, and it turns out it broke their code later, they're going to be very unhappy, and they're not going to use your feature again. So you want to come back and say, hey, I'm going to be transparent, encourage that they pause and review before they accept the suggestion, and you build that into the UI as well. The other thing is being transparent about the context you're using. So what file are you looking at in my IDE, or what variable, or whatever you're using? This is really good to be transparent about, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also we notice that when developers are able to see what context I used to give them an answer, if the answer is incorrect, they can go back and correct it and say, no, don't look at this file, look at that file, and it'll be more likely to give them the right answer. So we notice that developers are a lot happier when they know how you got to an answer. So we're working hard to add more configuration and more context to allow folks to know, okay, what did we use to get this answer? And asking permission where appropriate. This is really relevant in the agent space. So agents are supposed to do things on your behalf. It's really important that if you're changing a user system, that you ask for permission first. We do want to do things on your behalf. We want to be helpful, but before you change anything, we ask for confirmation where it's appropriate. So we're doing a lot of things in that space. And for resources, I can talk about this topic for lots of time, but I did want to leave you with some great resources here. We use a lot of the privacy and security GitHub Copilot Trust Center resources to, that talks about how we process data and security and all those things. We go through, every feature goes through an extensive responsible AI review process to ship these features. And if you're curious about that because you're building your own features, I linked the standard link here and the transparency report, and I'll have a link for the slides at the end of the slide deck. All right, this is my least favorite lesson. Be careful with COGS. Turns out AI is actually pretty expensive. And I didn't realize that until I started building a lot of features in this space. This is one of my favorite memes that one of the engineers sent me, and I loved it because I lived it all the time. I'm going to give you a story about what happened with rename suggestions. Okay, so when we first built rename suggestions, we had a button. And if you click on the button, you get the suggestions. And everyone came back and said, Dalia, why do we need a button? Like, why can't the suggestions just come up for me? This is like really bad user experience. So we removed the button. And I was super happy that we removed the button. But then a week before we were supposed to ship, one of the engineers on the VS Copilot team came back and said, Dalia, how many requests are you expecting for this feature? And I said, a lot. I put it in rename, which is really used a lot. And he said, well, that's not going to work. So that's a lot of requests. So we put the button back. And I was really sad about that. But then a couple months later, I noticed that VS Code came out with the same exact feature, but they had no button. So I went back to my engineers and asked, hey, can we look at that and like reconsider? And they said, yeah, let's look at that. So what we ended up doing is we ended up actually removing the button, but making it a toggle button. That way, if no one wants these suggestions, they can turn it off. The other thing we did was, some users were saying, well, when I go to rename my variable, a lot of times I know what name I want to give it. So in that case, that's fair game. So what we did is also add a delay. As soon as you do a rename, we're going to add a delay and not make a request until you're really sure that you're about to do a rename. So it's hopefully it'll stay without a button. But I want to just highlight that as you're building these features, sometimes you're going to have to change the UI to accommodate for these requests. But what is expensive today will be cheap tomorrow. So don't just fixate over the UI you're having today. Sometimes it's going to be cheaper. We've also gone to like older models and other things that we've tried out. So my biggest advice here is consider COGS as early in the design phase as possible. Finally, the last lesson I want to leave you with is enjoy the journey. I shared a lot of challenges and a lot of lessons and a lot of mistakes, but working on this has been one of the most fulfilling parts of my career because it's just amazing to be able to help developers or users in a way that you just couldn't do it before. That's like at the core something that really is satisfying to me as a person. So enjoy the journey, enjoy those moments when you actually get something to work. I want to share some of those moments with you. On the left is a picture of me and the engineer that worked on this feature with me, Amadeus. And we were just taking a walk on campus, and he was telling me, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we can use AI to give better names for our identifiers? And that was the start of that idea. And on the bottom right is a Teams meeting where we actually presented the demo of it working. That was an amazing moment. So take a moment for those moments and actually celebrate. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for coming to this talk. If you're going to take any pictures, this would be the picture to take of. I put all the lessons, the 10 lessons on here, and a link to the slide deck. I'll be around to answer questions right outside of here so the other speaker can come up, but I'd love to learn more about your journey or answer any questions you have. Thank you so much for having me.